Today, I'm excited to share with you a sci-fi, romance, and drama film from 2016 called Passengers. But beware, spoilers are ahead. In the vastness of space, the interstellar spaceship Avalon is on its journey to a colonized world known as Homestead 2. The ship's rooms lie empty as it glides smoothly on autopilot. All 258 crew members and 5,000 passengers are in hibernation, asleep for the voyage. Out of nowhere, the ship enters an asteroid belt, weakening its shields. Power is rerouted to reinforce the main shield, but the ship is still headed straight for a massive asteroid. Then, with a sudden impact, the asteroid slams into the ship, triggering multiple malfunctions. As the ship initiates self-repairs, one of the hibernation pods unexpectedly springs to life. Inside is Jim Preston, a mechanical engineer. His pod opens, and an automated system assists in his awakening, informing him that he has been in suspended animation for 120 years, and that the ship is just 4 months away from reaching Homestead 2. Jim is assured that he can enjoy the ship's luxurious amenities during this time. Jim is given instructions about his ID band, his cabin, and the primary activities he's expected to participate in before the ship reaches its destination. Excited yet nervous about meeting fellow passengers, he prepares himself, leaves his cabin, and heads to an automated classroom for a group learning session. Jim appears a bit anxious as a hologram explains the situation on Earth, describing it as overpopulated, overpriced, and overrated. The hologram instructs Jim to hold his questions until the end of the lesson, but he continues to ask why he's the only one present. Realizing the hologram cannot answer him, Jim decides to search for other people. He makes his way to the main concourse of the ship. Finding no one at the main concourse, Jim approaches an automated information desk for assistance. Requesting to speak with a real person, he is directed to find a steward. However, upon reaching the designated area, Jim discovers that no one is present there either. Determined, he requests to speak with the captain. Arriving at the bridge, Jim is unable to gain access, but observes that none of the main crew members are awake either. Jim heads to the observatory and discovers that the ship is actually 90 years away from Homestead 2. Realizing he woke up far too early, Jim rushes back to the concourse and sends a message back to Earth, seeking guidance on how to return to hibernation. The communication system informs him that it would take approximately 55 years to receive a response due to the costly connection. Jim is devastated by the news. While exploring, Jim stumbles upon the ship's bar and encounters another person. As he engages in conversation with the bartender, Jim notices something peculiar about him. When Jim goes to fetch a drink, he realizes that the bartender is actually an android. The android, named Arthur, leaves Jim puzzled as he tries to gather more information from him. However, Jim struggles to explain to Arthur how it's possible for him to be awake ahead of schedule. The next day, Jim wakes up in his cabin and heads to the cantina, where he discovers that many items on the menu are reserved exclusively for gold-class passengers. Jim settles for a simple coffee and ponders how to repair his hibernation chamber. After gathering all the necessary tools, he successfully gets it up and running again. Excitedly, he lies down inside the pod, but to his disappointment, nothing happens. Next, he attempts to use the tools he found to access the crew's hibernation chambers, but his efforts prove futile. Meanwhile, small malfunctions continue to occur around the ship. Jim frequents the bar, not just for drinks, but also to converse with Arthur. The android offers him advice, prompting Jim to take action by breaking into one of the gold-class rooms to experience some enjoyment aboard the ship. Jim explores all the restaurants, games, and entertainment systems available to him. As time goes by, Jim's loneliness intensifies, making his solitude unbearable. One day, in a drunken stupor, he roams around the hibernation pods and accidentally finds himself in an airlock containing spacesuits for spacewalks. Donning his suit, Jim enters the airlock, pushes a lever, and then presses the button to release the airlock door. Once outside the ship, Jim is captivated by the breathtaking view. He realizes he's the only conscious human being experiencing that moment in time. Releasing the magnets on his boots, Jim floats weightlessly in space, overwhelmed with a sense of devastation. He returns inside the ship, removes the suit, but returns to the airlock without it. With his hand on the lever, ready to end it all, Jim has a change of heart at the last moment. He rushes back inside, but slips on a bottle. As he stands up, his attention is immediately drawn to a woman named Aurora in one of the pods. Jim searches the directory for Aurora's files and listens to her passenger interview, becoming deeply enamored with her. Later, he is shown sitting beside her pod, still engrossed in listening to her interviews. Back at the bar, he reads some of her work and discusses her writing with Arthur. Jim becomes fixated on the irony of his situation, embarking on a journey to a new planet for a better life, waking up prematurely, and finding his ideal woman, only to be unable to reach her. He obsesses over Aurora and begins to entertain the idea of waking her up as well. Jim discusses his dilemma with the android, but the android fails to grasp the complexity of the situation. Initially, Jim decides against waking Aurora up for his own benefit, realizing that doing so would condemn her to the same fate of being stranded on the ship with him, ultimately leading to their deaths. However, as time passes, he becomes increasingly unable to shake off the idea. Finally, one day, he changes his mind. Jim goes to Aurora's pod and successfully activates it. As Aurora begins to wake up and undergoes the same process Jim experienced, he hides and retreats to his room. Sometime later, he ventures to the main concourse, hoping to encounter her. And there she is, just as bewildered as he was a year ago. Jim informs Aurora that they are the only ones awake and guides her to the observatory. There, he explains that he cannot access either the crew or the main controls of the ship. Aurora panics and insists on returning to her pod. Upon reaching her pod, Jim explains to Aurora that there is no equipment on board capable of returning them to hibernation, essentially revealing that they are stranded. Returning to the concourse, Jim advises Aurora to rest, considering she has just emerged from hibernation. Feeling sympathy for Jim, who has spent over a year alone on the ship, Aurora expresses her regret. Feeling remorseful for his actions, Jim returns to the bar and confides in Arthur, asking him not to reveal that he was the one who woke Aurora up. The following day, Aurora awakens. Aurora returns to the concourse and inquires with the automated information desk about the hibernation pods. Jim joins her there, and they decide to go for breakfast together. As they depart, the information desk experiences some sort of malfunction. In the cafeteria, Aurora notices that Jim has been having the same breakfast for over a year and decides to treat him to one of the menus reserved for gold-class passengers. They discuss the potential to repair the pods, but while Jim is resigned to their predicament, Aurora remains determined. She begins by searching the infirmary, then delves into research documents, and finally ends up at the crew's hibernation quarters, attempting to force open the doors. Jim observes an increase in malfunctions throughout the ship. Later on, Aurora expresses her frustration with life aboard the Avalon. She copes by writing, jogging around the ship, and swimming in the pool, gradually becoming more aware of their dire situation. Aurora visits the cafeteria to interview Jim, intrigued by the potential interest of his story. She questions him about his reasons for immigrating to the colony. Initially, Jim responds with company slogans, but then elaborates, expressing his hope that on the new world, he could carve out a meaningful existence and build a life for himself. Later, they find themselves in the observatory, where Aurora finally reveals her reason for being on the ship. Unlike the other passengers, she possesses a round-trip ticket. Her plan was to travel to Homestead too, spend a year there, and then return to Earth. She aspired to become the first journalist to accomplish this feat, intending to write the greatest story ever told. As Aurora begins to lose hope in finding a solution to their predicament, Jim devises a plan to lift her spirits. He takes her dancing, to the cinema, and to the basketball court, aiming to bring some joy into their confined existence. Finally, he introduces her to Arthur at the bar, hoping to provide her with some companionship and comfort. Aurora briefly enjoys a moment of relaxation until the reality of their situation resurfaces in her mind. Meanwhile, Jim is left alone with the android, grappling with guilt over his actions towards her. Shortly after, Jim is seen tinkering with something, and then the other Aurora enters the observatory to discover a miniature replica of the Chrysler building that he crafted for her. Sometime later, they go on a date at the bar. They enjoy dinner together and exchange stories about their lives. During the conversation, Aurora reveals that her father passed away when she was a teenager. After dinner, Jim leads Aurora to the airlock, where they don spacesuits. Together, they embark on a spacewalk, venturing out into the vastness of space. For Jim, having someone to share this magnificent experience with is truly special. Jim deactivates the magnets on their boots, allowing them to float together in the weightlessness of space. Upon returning inside the ship, they share a passionate kiss before retiring to Jim's cabin, where they spend the night together. From that moment on, they begin to live together as a couple. Aurora relocates to Jim's cabin and begins documenting her experiences aboard the ship. They engage in various activities together, including jogging, eating, and sleeping. Meanwhile, Jim continues to explore the ship and discovers the hydroponics bay. Jim surprises Aurora with flowers. On another occasion, as the ship passes by a red giant, they visit the observatory to witness the spectacle. It happens to be Aurora's birthday, so later that evening they celebrate in one of the ship's many restaurants, followed by festivities at the bar. Jim excuses himself to the washroom to retrieve the ring he crafted for Aurora, leaving her to chat with Arthur in the bar. Unaware that Jim had intended to keep it a secret, Arthur reveals to Aurora that Jim deliberately woke her up. Just as Aurora absorbs this shocking revelation, Jim returns, prompting her to confront him in utter disbelief. Furious and panicked, Aurora hastily gathers her belongings and runs away. Jim returns to his cabin to find it empty of all her belongings. The next day, he encounters her in the cafeteria, but the moment he speaks, she flees once again. Desperate, one night Aurora storms over to Jim's cabin, filled with rage, and begins to physically assault him, driven by a desire to inflict harm. Despite her avoidance of direct confrontation, Jim attempts to apologize and explain his actions to her over the communication system, hoping to reach her. Jim confesses to Aurora that he has fallen in love with her, but she remains unmoved. She cannot forgive him for the decision he made that altered her life forever.
I don't care!
One night, as Jim is in his cabin, another malfunction occurs aboard the ship. The ship encounters a critical error, causing the main command to shut down. Later, Jim steps into the elevator, only to find it malfunctioning. Meanwhile, Aurora enters the main concourse and discovers that Jim has planted a tree there. Then, Aurora heads to the cantina, where she finds that the food dispensary is also malfunctioning. Suddenly, they both hear the voice of the deck chief over the comms, inquiring about the origin of the tree. Hurriedly, they rush to the concourse and are startled to see Gus Mancuso standing in front of Jim's tree. They introduce themselves and explain the situation to the chief. Perplexed, he expresses disbelief that 3 pods could fail simultaneously. Mancuso escorts them to the bridge, where he realizes that there is indeed something amiss with the ship. However, he notes that the information on the systems must be verified manually. As they exit the bridge, a robot nearly falls on them, prompting Jim and Aurora to inform Mancuso about the increasingly frequent malfunctions occurring across the ship. Concerned, Mancuso states that such occurrences should not be happening and proceeds to demonstrate how to collect the data. While Mancuso checks on the pods, Jim joins him in the task. Jim has deduced what happened with Aurora's pod, much to the dismay of the deck chief, who finds Jim's actions to be reprehensible. Later, Chief is at the bridge, meticulously examining the collected data when Aurora joins him. They discuss the situation regarding her pod, but Chief admits he is powerless to rectify it. As they converse, Jim enters with the 16th broken robot. Mancuso begins to exhibit symptoms of hibernation sickness, prompting him to retire for rest. However, as he exits, he coughs up blood, causing concern among those present. That night, unable to sleep, Aurora decides to take a swim. Suddenly, gravity is lost throughout the ship, causing chaos. As Aurora struggles in the water, the lack of gravity makes it difficult for her to stay afloat, and she begins to drown as the water from the pool moves with her. Just in time, the gravity drive resets, and Aurora narrowly escapes with her life. They both encounter Mancuso as they search for him. The trio reunites at the bridge, where they begin piecing together the puzzle of the ship's malfunctions. Mancuso surmises that an incident occurred 2 years prior, resulting in the failure of a critical system. They realize they must locate and repair the source of the failure, as the entire ship is struggling to compensate for the malfunction. If left unresolved, the entire vessel risks being stranded. As they set out to address the issue, Mancuso suddenly faints. Jim and Aurora quickly come to his aid, guiding him to the infirmary for urgent medical attention. Mancuso's condition is terminal, and there are no treatments available to prolong his life. Sometime later, the three of them gather in the observatory. Mancuso solemnly hands Jim his ID bracelet and urges them to fix the ship. With his final breath, Mancuso passes away. Suddenly, the lights shift to an alarming red, and the ship begins to tremble violently. Jim implores Aurora to assist him, and together they hastily make their way toward engineering. However, they are met with yet another failure in the gravity drive. Before they can react, another malfunction occurs, affecting Arthur as well. With a heavy heart, Jim deactivates the android. They eventually reach engineering and begin searching for the source of the problem. Their investigation leads them to the power plant, and as they open the hatch, a sudden force pulls Aurora, Indiana. It becomes apparent that the asteroid impact has caused a breach in the hull in that area. Jim is also pulled into the breach, but he manages to hold onto the hatch as it begins to close on him. Despite his efforts, he is eventually pulled inside as well. Fortunately, they swiftly seal the breach to prevent further damage. However, as they address the initial problem, Jim quickly realizes that there are multiple breaches in the hull. The pair traces the trajectory of the meteor and discovers that it has struck the reactor control computer. Jim believes he can locate replacement parts for it. They manage to find the necessary component and successfully install it. However, despite their efforts, the process of venting the reactor still fails. They attempt to manually vent the reactor, but it proves unsuccessful once more. Jim realizes that he needs to open the vent door from outside the ship in order to properly cool down the reactor. They head to the airlock, where Jim prepares to venture outside. Before he goes, he gives Aurora Mancuso's bracelet, acknowledging the possibility that he may not return. She assists him with the suit, and as he enters the airlock, she instructs him to return since she cannot survive on the ship without him. Aurora returns to the reactor, where temperatures have reached dangerous levels. A bolt from the reactor flies into her arm as Jim approaches the vent from the outside and notices the door. The temperature in the reactor room rises as he attempts to open the vent door by bypassing it. He quickly recognizes that he will have to physically keep the door open so that the reactor can vent, and he informs Aurora. She dislikes the plan, but he goes ahead with it and instructs her to vent the reactor. She does not want him to die, and they dispute, but he insists that they save the other people, and she vents the reactor. The technique is effective, but the fumes from the reactor push Jim away, causing his bond to break. His suit's pressure is also reducing. He informs Aurora what occurred, and she rushes to go to another suit and bring him in. He apologizes again to her. She puts on a suit and flies out to get him, but her tether is too short. She's pulled back, but she takes his rope and pulls him in. Aurora drags Jim inside the infirmary, only to discover that he has already died. She uses Mancuso's wristband to bypass medical protocols and resurrect him. The medical pod does the procedure automatically and revives Jim. Aurora forgave him. Later, Aurora repairs Arthur, and they give Mancuso a befitting space burial. Jim takes her to the infirmary and informs her that he has discovered a way to use the medical pod as a sleep chamber. He tells her to get into the pod and spend the rest of the journey inside. But as it turns out, she declines and decides to stay with him awake on the ship. Jim finally proposes to her, and they spend their lives on the ship. 88 years later, the Avalon lands at Homestead 2. The crew awakens to discover the ship in an unexpected state. Aurora sends them a message, describing the story of her and Jim's lives on the ship while the others were sleeping. Make sure to subscribe and enable notifications so you can see more videos like this. Thank you for watching.